Our guest is Emeritus Laureate Professor John Hattie from the University of Melbourne. John Hattie is author of two bestseller books, Visible Learning and Visible Learning for Teachers. Visible Learning is a synthesis of more than 800 meta-studies covering more than 80 million students. John is widely recognized as one of the most influential figures in the field of education at the global level.
John, we are delighted to learn from you about feedback in teaching and learning based on your extensive body of work, and in particular the papers, The Power of Feedback and The Power of Feedback Revisited. Well, together, these papers have been cited over 20,000 times, which is quite an achievement. So welcome, John.
Thank you. Hola. Thank you,
Hola.
Hola.
To set the scene, let us start by exploring the impactful teaching strategies in higher education. What are the teaching strategies that work best in terms of student learning in higher education? And can you elaborate on the reasons for that effectiveness?
Yeah, thank you for that, because that's a question in the 2008 book I really struggled with. There are many, many different teaching methods that have been researched. And so since then, and earlier this year, I released the sequel with 2,100 meta-analyses. And it took me a long time, but I think I've worked out how to understand what looked initially like a bit of a mess. We had to go back a step and say there's at least two kinds of cognitive understandings that we want our students to have. The first relates to the content, to the facts, to the knowledge, to the concepts. We've been calling that the surface knowledge, or I now also call it the knowing that. What is that? What we want our students to know. There's also the knowing how. How are we going to relate these ideas together? How are we going to form deeper conceptual understandings? And there's also the knowing with. How are we going to use that information with new content, new problems, the transfer notions? Now that distinction between the knowing that, content, the surface, and the knowing how and the knowing with is huge. And the argument I put is that permission to be greedy. We want both. And when I make that distinction, and then I say, well, now let's look at the teaching methods. It turns out that the teaching methods have quite differential effects depending on what level of cognitive complexity. If you're looking at the knowing that, the knowing how, then what we often call the explicit instruction methods work very well. The old-fashioned lecture, the content. This is the time where the instructor is presenting information. Yes, I want more than that, but it is about those kind of more direct instruction, explicit instruction. If you want to then focus on the more deeper conceptual, that's where the more problem-based inquiry methods have a bigger effect. Like one of the things that intrigued me in 2008 is problem-based learning. There have been 30 or 40 meta-analyses showing systematically they have a very low effect. Like take first-year medicine. We know that the effect size of problem-based learning is 0 to negative. But in fourth-year medicine, it screams up to about 0.5. And that opened my eyes, and I went back through all the problem-based literature and looked at it and reclassified it, and it is the case that problem-based learning on the content, the surface, 0.15. On the deeper, 0.5. Now here's the problem, yo. If you go into problem-based learning before you have the content and the facts, you're kind of wasting the student's time. You need both. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not suggesting that they necessarily come in one order, surface to deep. Amanda Kapoor from Switzerland has done a lot of incredibly good work showing that if you start with problem-based learning, to find out what the students know and don't know, teach that, and then go back. And he and I and a colleague have done a review of the 50 different meta-analyses on flipped learning. Because once again, the effect sizes range from 0.08 to 1.08. That just does not make sense. But when you divide it up and say, are you specifically looking at the content and are you looking at the problem-based? Now here's the fascination with flipped learning. Typically, the students are asked to do the work before they come to class. In class, you're supposed to do the more inquiry learning. No, it doesn't work that way, primarily because there's hardly any study in the world that checks before you go into problem-based action learning, what is the knowledge and understanding? So you need both, and you need to actually separate them out. And so my encouragement to your viewers and people in the audience today is you've got to be a lot more systematic of aligning. And I call my model the intentional alignment model. You've got to align your teaching method with the nature of the content or the depth of content that you want. And then you start. Now, here's the thing that really surprised me. When I looked at the 480 different teaching methods, there's only one, maybe two, one that I could find that deliberately attends to both the content, the specificity, and then the depth. And that's the jigsaw method. And if you don't know what it is, it's well worth following up. And I encourage your colleagues today to think about other forms of teaching that cross. So my message being is, if you're a problem-based teacher, I'm not going to hire you. If you're a direct instruction teacher, I'm not going to hire you. I want both at the right time. And that's where I think you can start to unravel the success of teaching strategies.
So interesting. And now let us move to the topic of our talk today. So feedback in teaching and learning. What defines high quality feedback in higher education?
Well, I've, like many others, have spent a lot of my research time trying to answer that question. And it dawned on me late in the piece, but it did dawn on me that I was asking the wrong question. We still want to know about the nature of high quality feedback, but we're going to switch it from looking at what the instructor does to what the student does. And like, it doesn't take you long when you do classroom observation of academics teaching, of schools teaching, to find out that we give an incredible amount of feedback. And yes, we know that the more the feedback is helping the student about where they go next, the more powerful it is. And here's the problem. Many of the students, particularly by the time they get to university, realize that the nature of the feedback they get doesn't help them very much. So they're not listening. And so what we found is that the three things, to answer your question, is the most effective feedback was feedback that was heard, understood, and actioned. Like when we go to classrooms where there's a lot more research on this, despite the incredible amount of feedback we give in a day, students on average hear, receive, and action about 8 seconds worth. Many of them have learned that feedback costs. When you give me feedback, I got it wrong. I have to do it again. I have to invest more time. So like me, in my own, like in my marriage life, I am the world's best selective listener. I choose not to hear. It's much easier than having to do it again. And many of our students are like this. So that's the first part of my answer to your question, Mara, was the feedback heard, understood, and action. So instructors, you're going to have to stop now and then and ask your students, what did you understand by the feedback I gave you? It's a bit frightening when you do it. Now, we asked instructors to hand back the work with all the lovely comments on it, grade, wait a day so it's not just short-term memory, and then ask the students, just jot down in bullet points, what did you understand by the feedback I gave you 2 days ago? That's when you find out what effective feedback is. That's when you find out that most of the feedback you give never penetrated. And that's when you start to realize that's what you have to do. And so that's, this is the first big question. So I am going to take a touch more. The other thing we found was that instructors see feedback very much about helping the student understand what the goal. And they're also very, very good at helping the student tell them how well they're going. But when you ask students, what do they understand by feedback? They have a quite different notion. Students don't want to look backwards as much as instructors do about how we went. They want to look forward. They want to know, how can I improve? And if there's no improvement feedback, they will sit there. We've done a study where we deliberately wrote 2 pages of feedback with some where to next information and 2 pages of feedback without. And I remember the student sitting there with his 2 pages and he waved it at me and he said, I got no feedback. Well, he did, but his story was there was nothing in there to help him improve. So my two answers to your question is nothing wrong with feedback about how you're going, where you're going. It's the legitimization, but it has to help the student where to go next, and it has to be heard, understood, and actioned.
Okay, and reflecting on the role of feedback in deep learning, how does feedback contribute to deepening learning processes?
Well, this is where I want to go back to that intentional alignment model. This is where I want you to be very clear when you're making feedback to students that this is about the content. And in a separate occasion, this is about the depth. When you put them together, the students, particularly university students, all they think you care about is knowledge and facts. In fact, there's a bit of a conspiracy. The brightest students want more focus on the facts because that's the game they're winners at. And when you put them together, they hear the facts and they miss out on the depth. So I'm asking you to have almost a pause between. Right, now we're going to focus on the knowledge here. You didn't understand this correctly. We're going to have to go back and get the knowledge here. You're going to have to go back and read this, do this. Now, separately, I want to talk to you about your understanding of this notion. And that gap between them, particularly if it's a very decisive gap, helps dramatically because it's telling the student very clearly, this is where the improvement is. Put them together, like all of us, we're going to take the easiest way out. We're going to say, we're going to focus on the content. And so that separation of feedback about the content, feedback about the depth. Let me add one more. Praise. Feedback to the student about their effort, about their qualities. It has a massive diluting effect. Once again, put praise in the sentence, go wait 2 days, ask the students what do they understand with the feedback. They'll remember the praise. They'll remember the praise, whether it be positive or negative. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't not praise students because it's very important to help build relationships. But once again, I want a gap. Look, Joe, you did great work here. I really like the effort you put into it, the way you read these things. Pause, come back. 3 or 4 minutes later, pause, and then talk about the others. Because students, naturally, they want to hear the good stuff. They want to know what they did well. But fundamentally, they want to know how to improve. Students are improvement agents. We look in the rear vision, and we have to turn that around.
Can we use the expression feed forward somehow?
Yes, that's the notion. We want to feed. Now, don't get me wrong. I want the feedback. I want the where we go. I want that as well, because that forms the basis of the feed forward. But you just check when you've finished next Sunday writing all your comments on your students' assignments, and then put them in 2 piles. One pile where there's some feed forward information, one pile where there's not. Hand them back. Do that exercise of asking them to remember. I guarantee that where you had some feed forward, they will remember that because that's what they're searching for. They want to improve. Feed forward.
In practical terms, what steps are needed for teachers and students to effectively engage in feedback practices?
Well, the first is that awareness. Like one of the fundamental assumptions in my whole model is that when you walk into a lecture room, when you walk into a lab, when you walk into any kind of university teaching environment, I want you to say, my job here today is to evaluate my impact. And then all good things follow. It's not to get through the curriculum. It's not to get through this lesson. It's not to impart this, that, or the other thing. And so I want you to be a really good listener. And I think it's fascinating that we have hundreds and hundreds of books on how to talk and how to speak, and hardly any books on how to listen. And so I want you to be a listener. And it's like, I want you to listen to hear how your feedback was received. I want you to listen to hear how it was understood. And many students completely misunderstood the brilliant feedback that you've given. So I want you to be a listener. I want you to pause every now and then. Like, take, for example, when you're instructing and you're asking questions. Now, we know from the observations that 90% of the questions you ask are about the facts. Is it any surprise the students think that's what you value? I want you to listen. to the nature of the questions you ask. Maybe take a video through a Zoom or whatever you're doing, and then go back and say, well, what was the questions? And of those 90% questions about the facts, they nearly all require less than 3-word answers. Now, I want you to change that. I want you to have much more engagement, not just asking students to speak for the nation that the student voice is important, because there is a time when it's not important, like when you're teaching the content. That's you. But when you're in the teaching the relationships between ideas, the knowing how, I want you students to think aloud. Like your students are sitting there saying, wow, Mara asked that question of the class and student over there answered it. Wow, he's smart. But what the student really wants to know is what was going on here? What was the processes they were using? What was the thought process? Is it just straight recall? Well, if all the questions are about the facts, then it probably is. But they want to hear the problem solving. Like I've done this work has been done more in schools than in the university setting. And like we've got in our own database 20,000 hours of teachers teaching. And when you ask how many times in 20,000 hours of different teachers, 20,000 teachers teaching, do you hear a teacher thinking aloud? Or do you hear a teacher asking a student to thinking aloud? In 20,000 hours, 0. So I want you to think aloud. I want you to think that, and I ask you this, Mara, the very best speaker you've ever heard at a conference, your very best academic you've ever met. And I put it to you that a major reason that that person rates highly on your list is they think aloud and you can hear it. And it's a massive privilege. Like my guru, Michael Scriven, he passed away recently, sadly, at 96. He was brilliant at thinking aloud. And just to sit and hear him speak for an hour and hear him thinking aloud and going through the process he does, it was a gift. Whereas so often we perform and we portray as if we've got it right the first time. So I want you to be a lot more thinking aloud. I want to get your students, particularly when you get to the knowing how side of the teaching, getting them to think aloud, because all your students are sitting there saying, how did they do it? How did they go from there to there? And it's not a straight line. It's a staccato. It's a messy line. And so that's what the students want to know. So that's the essence of being optimizing the feedback, is much more thinking aloud about the problem solving.
Yeah,
I love the message.
Sorry, Mara. Sorry, no.
I love the message about the impact. And let me just do a quick follow-up on your answer. Is there a risk of feedback having a negative impact?
Oh, look, a third of feedback we give has a negative impact. A third. It's not received in the way we intended it. It's received by students in a negative emotion. They see it as a negative criticism, that they're dumb and stupid. And I'm sure that's no intent of the instructor. The whole fascination with feedback is not only is it one of the most powerful influences, it's also one of the most variable. And most of my work has been looking at that variability. And that's why if you focus on the where to next, particularly, you can reduce that fear of variability. When you focus on listening to how students understand the feedback, it's about their emotions. It is about the negative. So yes, feedback can have, and it's kind of the work I'm doing at the moment. Feedback costs. There's a price we pay. It can affect our self-esteem. Oh, I thought I did a really good essay here. I handed in a really good lab assignment and I got a D. Whoa, does that go to the heart of me as a learner? Feedback costs. They make me do it again. I haven't got the time. I don't want to put in the effort. And so there's a whole lot of issue there. And so, and I'm good at this. I don't hear it. I choose not to listen. And therefore it has a 0 to negative effect. So absolutely feedback can be negative.
And peer feedback and reflection, we believe, can improve students' work and their learning experiences. What are the most effective strategies for integrating peer feedback with the reflexive practices to foster metacognitive skills?
One of the things that my own teaching a few years ago, and most of my teaching, because I work in a graduate schools with graduates, with people going on to do theses, PhDs, etc. And many years ago, it dawned on us that what we were doing is we were getting the students to do their assignments, handing them in, and we spent a lot of time checking APA style and the grammar and the text and all that. And we had a certain circumstance, and I have to say it was an accident, but it worked, where we said, no, before you hand it in to us, we want you to mimic what a journal does. Because one of the things we talked about was how come when you send an article for review, you get reviewers' comments back, and if they reject your article, you know the reviewers' comments were terrible. And so it's that whole notion of, when do you teach the students to be critics? So what we did is we said, before you hand it in, we're going to assign you to other students. They're going to have to read and comment, written comment, back to you. And when you hand in your assignment, we want you to hand in your final assignment only, the 2 critics' comments, and your reaction, exactly what you do in a journal article. And we also then, because it allowed us to check that the 2 others were actually doing a decent job, it dramatically changed the nature of what we did. Firstly, we didn't have to comment about the API and all that anymore because the critics did it, students did themselves. We also learned very quickly that we had to teach those other 2 how to be critics. It's not something you just do naturally. And so that was a very powerful way of doing peer feedback. And let me note one thing in that example. Never ask a student to grade another student. They don't have your knowledge. They don't know what they don't know. It can be mean, it can be nasty, it can be improper. It's not about grading. The whole point is, how do peers help improve what comes in? Now, some of our colleagues said, oh, that's cheating. You're getting the students to comment before you do. And we say, no, this is learning. It's learning how to be a critic. It's learning how to respond to critics. So I want to be careful with peer feedback. It can be extremely powerful, but it's powerful in the process of thinking. It's powerful in the process of doing. Please never ask your peers to grade. It is your sole job as a peer to help improve. And I think, therefore, it can be extremely powerful.
So interesting. So let us now move to the topic of digital technology in education. And John, what are your thoughts on the use of AI to provide feedback, especially in large-scale educational contexts, such as massive open online courses?
Well, we did a study a few years ago. I met up with the Turnitin team. Did you know the app Turnitin?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So I met up with them, and I was impressed that they had so much data. And so I met with them a few times, and we collectively did a study together where we took many thousands of university assignments that had been submitted to Turnitin. They had got the feedback through the Turnitin electronic system, and then they resubmitted. And they got a grade, first time and second time. So I took all the comments that Turnitin did to the assignments and coded them all in terms of, was it about where they're going, how they're going, where to next, and other attributes. And then I asked the students, when they handed them back, the students that improved, what was the nature of their feedback compared to the students who didn't improve? It was all to do with the percentage of where to next feedback. And the technology was much, much better at doing that. The technology never talked about you, Mara. They couldn't care less who you were. And the students loved that. And we've done many studies where we've given students electronic feedback and person feedback, and at the end asked them, what do they prefer? Nearly always it's the electronic, because the electronic doesn't know I'm the naughty student. It doesn't know that I failed 3 times before. It looks at what I do. And we can turn the machine to focus more on the where to next. So you can imagine, I'm an incredibly big fan of the technologies in front of us. Yes, there are some problems and guardrails, cheating. And we recently wrote a free paper that I'm happy to send you all, trying to look at how we build those guardrails, because we shouldn't not use it. It's very powerful. It's also very powerful for marking. And I encourage my students, when you've done your piece of work, put it into ChatGPT and ask to improve it. Now, I want to see what ChatGPT did, and I want you to see your commentary about how you improved it. I don't want you to not use that, because I know you're going to anyway. I want you to optimize it. And so I think these techniques, and also grading. There's a lot of people working out there on how you use ChatGPT to do grading, and I'm doing some of that work myself. It takes an incredible amount of time off. But once again, it's like all tools. It does a very good baseline. It's how you improve it. And the argument that we put is that these tools are going to demand more of us as instructors, particularly in the university setting, to do 5 things. We're going to have to be much better at teaching our students to ask probative questions. Because if you ask ChatGPT the wrong question, you get the wrong answer. Much better at asking the right questions. You're going to have to be a lot better at assessment credibility. Is it right? Is it wrong? Like one of the assignments one person did recently was, I want you to go into ChatGPT and ask John Hattie these sets of questions. And the person then sent me the answers. And some of them, most of them are pretty right. Some of them were just completely and utterly wrong. Some of them picked up some of my critics who totally misinterpreted what I've said and quoted it back as me. So how good are they at assessment credibility? The third is evaluation, evaluative thinking. Is it good enough? Have they covered the right areas? Has it got the right depth? The fourth is oral literacy. We're going to get after our students doing a lot more talking as a consequence of doing the whole notion of ChatGPT. It's not just about writing anymore. We want much more discussion. Let's talk about what the findings were. And that's certainly what the workplace is asking for too. And the fifth and last one is wise choices, because the difference in ChatGPT compared to most other technologies is that if you ask it, well, what do I do next? It gives you answers. That's hardly ever happened before. We've needed a person. But some of the things that ask you to do next may not be the right. So my point is we need to think a lot more about the skills. And if you think about those 5 skills, they're pretty important skills for us in the university sector. So bring them on. Let's bring it on. Let's do this. Let's stop worrying that ChatGPT is going to allow the students to cheat. Change the nature of your assessment. Turn it more into a dialogue. Turn it more into a critique. Turn it into more about how you're using this tool, students, and what's your evaluative thinking. What's your assessment credibility in light of what it says? Very powerful.
So much food for thought.
We are coming towards to the end of our conversation, but I would like to go a little bit further on this AI thing. How do you think AI can be optimized for this providing feedback without compromising its quality?
Without compromising what, sorry?
The quality of feedback.
Oh, once again, I am using ChatGPT to give feedback, and then I'm asking the students to comment on the feedback. Did they hear it, understand it, and improve it? And that's where my value comes in. Now, I can then add to it. I can contradict it. I can have a conversation with them about it. So I put a lot more emphasis on that part of my teaching, is the reaction to it. Not ban it, but use it. And so I think and sometimes the feedback's just not good enough. It's the same that we know with every teacher, no matter what level of teaching you're in, they always take a resource and want to modify it and adapt it to them. The same with feedback on ChatGPT. Don't accept it. Interrogate it. Critique it. Make the students do it. You do it. So I think it's a very powerful way for us to do it. I would never, sorry about this, my friend, I would never accept your feedback on my students' assignments. I would want to look at it because I want to know what you're saying to them, how it relates to what I'm saying to them. How different is it from what you do to what a machine does? It doesn't abrogate my responsibilities to do nothing. I have to then do it, but I do something different. I get the machine to do all the hard lifting, and I want to focus on the quality control.
John, you give us plenty food for thought and inspiring ideas to better incorporate feedback in our teaching and learning. So thank you. And Mara,
yes,
I'm not sure.
I think we might have time for a very, very final question. What advice would you give to teachers in higher education to implement effective feedback?
Well, it's being very clear up front of what success looks like. I mean, up front, near the start of your whole series of classes, so that the students know when good's good enough. Like, they're not going to play their computer games if they don't know what the goal is. Sometimes in our classes, we ask them to wait and say, the goal you'll discover is when you see the test. It's too random. So be upfront of what success looks like. Check during the course how well you are going at helping the students get to that goal, which means you're going to have to understand where they start. Good diagnosis, good monitoring of your progress, therefore through their progress, how close they are to the goal. Give them as many ways as you can to seek and use the feedback that you are so good at giving them, but checking. Do they hear? Do they understand? Do they listen? And then focusing, as we just talked about then, how then you can improve the quality of the nature of your feedback. I also want you, going back to where we started today, to be a lot more clearer about separating out what are the skills and the content and what are the processes. Now, what we do, this is hard to do, and I acknowledge it. And we know it's resisted, but it's the most powerful. Backward design. Start, before you start your course, write your assignments for the end. Write 2 assignments. Write an assignment first about the concepts and understandings the students you want to have at the end of your course. And then I want you to sit down and work out from that, what is the content and the skills you need for that depth of understanding. Now, here's why it's hard, Mara. If you do this, you soon find out that almost half the stuff you teach and the content has no value. And that upsets a lot of people because they think they're going to have that content. Well, if you don't evaluate it as part of your assignments, the students will soon realize it's not important. And sometimes what we do is we give them lots of stuff and then we ask them to guess which part of that stuff is important. So do those 2 assignments. Then I want you to have your colleagues, sit down with your colleagues and critique them. Like, it's amazing when you look at right across the visible learning research, when instructors critique each other about their teaching, about their assessment, about their marking, etc., it has one of the highest effects, and the students are not even in the room. Teaching should not be a solitary activity. So critique those assessments. Are they good enough? Are they clear? Are they related to the outcome? And then I'm quite happy for you to teach to the assessments, provided you do those 2 things. What is the content, the skills, the procedures? What is the depth of understanding, that whatever? And that's where I think you can start. Notice what I didn't say, Mara. I'm not a great fan talking about teaching methods. In fact, I'm probably too strong. I kind of don't care what teaching method you use. I care about the impact of that teaching method. And I want you to care. What is the impact you're having on your students? The students who are struggling, the students in their brightest. They walk into the room wanting to improve. Let's help them.
What a powerful message to finish our talk. Okay, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insights, John. It was very much appreciated.
Well, you have a wonderful seminar, and one day I soon hope that I can come to your beautiful country.
Absolutely, you're so welcome.